Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we slow down the story to see the structure underneath the headlines. Today we are undertaking an analytical deep dive into one of the most persistent and dynamic brands in corporate history, Pepsi.
We're examining a company that is just defined by these profound contradictions. I mean, on one hand, you have the corporation that entered into this incredibly complex barter agreement that, resulted in it acquiring a Soviet naval fleet.
Which is an amazing story.
It is. And then you contrast that with the same company, years later, suffering this catastrophic reputation hit over a single, deeply misunderstood commercial about social justice.
Our mission, then, is to trace the constraints and the decisions that structurally link these seemingly unrelated extremes.
Right. To do that, we've synthesized, well, a wide stack of sources, articles, legal briefs, deep historical reports, and some very specific market analyses, all to understand the real mechanisms that drove Pepsi-Cola's evolution into, the massive, globally diversified entity we know as PepsiCo.
Okay, so before we jump into that evidence, let's orient you to why we approach topics this way. This is a WhyItTV deep dive.
And for us, understanding comes from context, not conclusions. We aren't here to deliver a verdict on the company. We're here to analytically examine how it functions as a system of decisions constrained by law, geopolitics, and, of course, competition.
WhyItTV uses multiple formats. You might encounter an explainer for foundational knowledge, a debate to highlight contrasting arguments, or a critique to evaluate outcomes.
The deep dive is the most evidence-focused of these formats. Our role here is to provide you, the listener, with the necessary analytical framework.
We focus on the deeper context, the specific financial pressures, the unique geopolitical constraints, and the hard legal limits that shape this company's trajectory over more than a century.
We're really looking for the structural forces at play.
And to organize this large, complex body of information, to surface patterns across time, and support the deeper contextual storytelling we aim for, we do utilize artificial intelligence as a research and synthesis partner.
It just helps us construct that comprehensive timeline so we can focus our discussion entirely on those underlying mechanisms.
So our mission today is very specific. We're tracing the core strategy of constant reinvention.
We need to demonstrate how a repeated pattern of financial failure led to innovative, disruptive marketing, how extreme global expansion forced these complex logistical and diplomatic bartering situations.
And how that aggressive yet necessary pursuit of timely youth culture led to both massive success and, well, some spectacular cultural missteps.
Exactly.
Let's start right at the beginning then, part one, the original instability. Because the story of Pepsi is often told as this sort of cheerful rivalry with Coca-Cola.
Right, the Cola Wars.
But the truth is that Pepsi's genesis is defined by frequent, almost fatal failures that forced it to reinvent itself again and again.
The foundation of this eventual global giant started, quite humbly, not in a massive factory, but as a pharmacist's tonic in New Bern, North Carolina.
And the inventor was Caleb Bradham, a pharmacist and entrepreneur who first concocted the drink back in 1893.
And it wasn't called Pepsi-Cola yet, it was just Brad's drink. And the origin story, it echoes a trend common to many early soft drinks.
It was seen as medicinal.
Exactly. It was originally believed to have medicinal benefits, specifically intended to aid digestion and ease an upset stomach.
Bradham renamed it Pepsi-Cola in 1898. The sources suggest a couple of intertwined theories for the name, both linked to its perceived health function.
The dominant theory is that it was a reference to the digestive enzyme pepsin, combined with the presence of cola nuts in the recipe.
The other theory, which is less technical but maybe more consumer-focused, is that Bradham and his early customers felt the drink, it sounded and tasted good and reflected a certain pep or energy.
What we can definitively discard is that persistent bit of folklore, that the name came from the sound of opening a can, that popshi sound.
Right, that's just a historical anachronism.
Completely. When the drink was named in 1898, it was sold exclusively in these heavy glass bottles with a crown cork. The metal beverage can, especially the easy open kind, that wouldn't be invented for decades.
So the naming was purely internal marketing. It was designed to convey vitality and a kind of health benefit.
After the rename, Bradham moved the operation out of his drugstore into a rented warehouse by 1903. This early period was marked by rapid but structurally fragile growth.
By 1915, he had grown the business to a respectable million-dollar company.
And he was keenly observing his competitor, the Coca-Cola Company, and he very aggressively mimicked their primary distribution structure.
The bottling franchise system.
Exactly. This allowed him to scale rapidly, reaching about 300 independent bottlers across the Southeast by World War I.
300 bottlers is significant scale for the era, but the sources make it crystal clear that the underlying structure was, well, utterly vulnerable.
And that vulnerability wasn't in the competition, it was in the financial management of the supply chain.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation rooted in global economics.
It was. Bratta made a massive speculative error following the First World War. Sugar prices had skyrocketed during the war due to scarcity, and he began heavily overstocking the commodity. He expected prices to continue their upward trajectory or at least, remain stable.
But the global commodity markets had a brutal reversal.
They collapsed. In 1920, the post-war recession hit, and sugar prices just plunged dramatically. They fell by 90% in some markets over the course of a year.
And that left the young company paralyzed.
Completely. They were sitting on this massive inventory that had been purchased at wildly inflated wartime prices, which, overnight became virtually worthless.
That kind of rapid asset devaluation is impossible for any young company to absorb.
The structural consequences were immediate. This financial pressure was simply too much for the balance sheet to bear, and it forced the first major structural reset. Pepsi Cola Co. declared bankruptcy by 1923.
And the consequence of that, a company that was valued at $1 million just 8 years prior, was sold off for a mere $30,000 to a Wall Street banker.
And this initial failure is so critical because it demonstrates the critical early constraint. Supply chain risk, driven by commodity volatility, was exponentially more destructive than direct market competition from Coca-Cola.
And this wasn't a one-off event, which is the truly terrifying part when you study the company's history. It established a pattern
Of instability that just repeated itself. The company changed hands several times in the 1920s, struggling to find any solid financial footing.
It declared bankruptcy again in 1931, right in the middle of the Great Depression.
And the sources confirm that the second failure was also largely due to recurrent financial losses from speculating on or just failing to mitigate wildly fluctuating sugar prices.
So twice, financial speculation and supply chain risk, not consumer demand or the product's taste, drove the company into ruin.
And that deeply rooted instability wasn't just a weakness, it was the ultimate constraint that set the stage for the radical strategic pivot that would define the company's future.
The necessity of challenging the market leader through sheer innovative value. That brings us to part 2, the mechanics of the challenger strategy.
The person who bought the bankrupt Pepsi assets in 1931 was a man named Charles Guth. He was the president of Loft Incorporated, a major candy manufacturer that operated retail stores with popular soda fountains.
And the motivation for this purchase is one of the great business anecdotes. It wasn't driven by market optimism or love for the product.
No, Guth acquired Pepsi because he was absolutely furious. Coca-Cola had repeatedly refused to give him a discount on syrup for his Loft soda fountains.
So they're essentially denying him a competitive edge in his own stores?
Exactly. It was a transaction fueled by spite, but what emerged was this brilliant strategy born out of dire necessity.
When Guth took over, he had Loft's chemists reformulate the Pepsi-Cola syrup, and that set the foundation for a renewed competitive battle.
The strategic move came in 1936, and the timing was crucial. This is during the depths of the Great Depression, when every nickel counted for the average American family.
And Pepsi introduced a new strategy centered entirely around 2 factors: price and volume.
Coca-Cola had a decades-long, structurally rigid approach. They sold their classic 6-ounce bottle for 5 cents, the nickel drink.
Pepsi seized on this rigidity. They introduced a 12-ounce bottle, exactly twice the volume, and priced it at the identical 5 cents.
That is what you'd call a classic flanking move. They didn't engage Coca-Cola on taste, which is subjective. They engaged them on math, which is objective.
It was about proving Pepsi was demonstrably better value.
And they communicated this value proposition with laser precision through one of the earliest and most enduring advertising jingles. It played repeatedly on the radio, ensuring everyone understood the deal.
Pepsi-Cola hits the spot. 12 full ounces? That's a lot. Twice as much for a nickel, too. Pepsi-Cola is the drink for you.
What's fascinating is that Coca-Cola couldn't immediately retaliate.
Why not?
Because their reliance on the 6-ounce bottle was structural. It was tied into their entire massive bottling infrastructure, their contracts, their whole brand identity.
So changing the standard size or price would have meant renegotiating thousands of contracts, retooling bottling plants.
and undermining their long-established brand promise. Pepsi exploited this rigidity perfectly.
The impact was explosive and immediate. Sales surged, with 500 million bottles of Pepsi consumed in 1936 alone.
The company's profits doubled between 1936 and 1938. This proved that exploiting the competitor's structural weakness rather than simple imitation was the only path to survival for the challenger brand.
Yet even this massive success was instantly complicated by the same instability that plagued its early years, only this time it was legal instability.
This refers to the legal scrutiny Charles Guth faced. The near-bankrupt Loft Company successfully sued Guth for possession of the profitable Pepsi-Cola assets.
On what grounds?
The case, Guth v. Loft, centered on the argument that Guth had used Loft's resources, financing, and corporate facilities to establish Pepsi's success, essentially diverting corporate opportunity for his personal gain while Loft was floundering.
And the court agreed with Loft.
It did. So the price-volume innovation secured Pepsi's market footing, but the man who made it happen was immediately stripped of its ownership by the courts.
The company's instability just shifted from financial bankruptcy to legal ownership disputes. It seems instability is simply part of Pepsi's DNA.
Following this period, in the 1940s, under a new president, Walter Mack, Pepsi made another critical structural decision, targeting an audience that the market leader was actively ignoring.
This is a landmark moment in marketing history. For decades, general audience advertising either completely excluded African Americans or relied on demeaning stereotypes.
And Pepsi recognized this demographic as an enormous untapped market. Mack pioneered this niche strategy. He hired Hennon Smith and, crucially, Edward F. Boyd to establish and lead an all-black sales team.
And this team was given the directive to develop advertising campaigns that explicitly and positively targeted Black consumers, moving beyond just the price-volume argument.
And the content of these campaigns was radically different for the time. They consciously focused on aspirational and positive imagery.
Like what?
We see ads featuring smiling, middle-class Black families, including one famous image of a mother and son, that son being a young Ron Brown, who would later become a U.S. Secretary of Commerce.
Wow.
They also launched campaigns like Leaders in Their Fields, profiling prominent African Americans like the Nobel Peace Prize winner Ralph Bunche and the photographer Gordon Parks.
This wasn't just a calculation for sales, although it certainly boosted them. It was a structural differentiation.
It was. Pepsi was positioning itself as the inclusive, value-conscious choice, gaining deep market affinity by demonstrating respect and inclusion. It set itself distinctly apart from the broad, often exclusionary focus of its competitor.
That foundation of difference, being the inclusive, timely value option, the perennial challenger, culminated in the third major strategy shift in the 1960s.
This was the movement from advertising the tangible product, the price and volume, to marketing a desired identity.
The famous Pepsi Generation campaign. The competitive landscape of the Cola Wars.
The mechanism changed entirely. The campaign moved away from the Depression-era emphasis on price to emphasizing a certain lifestyle and attitude. The core slogan was, "Come alive, you're the Pepsi generation."
This was revolutionary because it leveraged the emerging generational gap of the 1960s. Pepsi positioned itself as the choice of the young, the forward-looking demographic.
It defined its consumers not by the soda itself, but by these highly desirable subjective qualities. Pepsi was telling its consumers they were livelier, active people who viewed the world with a young view of things.
Which, by necessity, relegated Coca-Cola to being associated with tradition, nostalgia, and a timeless quality. The small towns, the history, the established order.
This contrast cemented Pepsi as the timely alternative, perpetually embracing the present moment.
This is the birth of modern lifestyle marketing. And this core identity, being the hip, youthful, culturally aware alternative, is the structural risk factor that Pepsi would chase for the next 6 decades.
And it would drive both its greatest triumphs and its most spectacular public failures.
Which leads us directly into part 3, where the challenges escalated beyond domestic branding battles and into the realm of high-stakes geopolitics and Cold War economics.
Part 3 is where we dissect the operational constraints, the complex bartering logistics, and the famous, almost unbelievable story of the naval fleet acquisition.
A transaction forced entirely by diplomatic and financial necessity.
The foundation of this story dates back to 1959, specifically the U.S. exhibition held in Moscow. This was the scene of the famous kitchen debate between then Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev.
And Pepsi's presence there was not an accident. Donald Kendall, who was Pepsi's CEO at the time, was deeply involved in U.S.-Soviet trade relations, and he personally arranged for the company's product to be featured prominently at the exhibition.
At a crucial moment during the debate, Nixon offered Khrushchev a Pepsi from a display vending machine. The Soviet leader took a sip and reportedly said, "This is very refreshing."
And Kendall seized this historic photo op. It was the first time a Soviet leader had publicly endorsed, however casually, an American consumer product.
Kendall leveraged that exposure for years, and after extensive negotiation, Pepsi became the first foreign consumer product sold in the USSR in 1972. But here's the critical structural problem.
Cold War currency restrictions.
Exactly. The regulatory hurdle was insurmountable. Soviet rubles were strictly controlled by the government and were not convertible to other major currencies. They were effectively worthless outside the USSR,
So Pepsi couldn't accept rubles for the syrup it was shipping.
which forced them to devise an ingenious, non-monetary logistical solution. They reverted to ancient trade mechanics. They used barter.
The deal they struck was highly unusual.
Yeah.
Instead of rubles, Pepsi would receive payment in the form of Stolichnaya vodka from the Soviet government.
And Pepsi would then take that vodka and sell it in Western markets, primarily the United States, to recover the full cost of the syrup they shipped to Moscow.
This arrangement was structurally sound and, mutually beneficial for years. Pepsi expanded its sales inside the Soviet economy, and Stolichnaya gained massive new access to Western markets.
All without the Soviets having to spend or acquire scarce hard currency.
However, by 1989, geopolitical currents created a new crisis. Following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. imposed trade sanctions.
And this made it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for Pepsi to sell Stolichnaya effectively in its main U.S. market. The established barter system was fundamentally compromised.
And at this exact moment, Pepsi's contract was expiring.
So CEO Donald Kendall once again flew to Moscow to renegotiate. He needed to be paid for the massive quantities of syrup they were shipping. Some sources estimated the needed payment at around $3 billion over the life of the new contract.
But the Soviets, amidst deep economic difficulty, still lacked sufficient hard currency.
And that is the precise moment the situation took its dramatic and surreal turn. The Soviets had assets they were liquidating. They proposed an unusual alternative to pay for the syrup.
They would transfer ownership of a fleet of naval vessels they could no longer afford to maintain or fuel.
So Pepsi, a soft drink company, briefly came into possession of a large collection of naval vessels, including decommissioned battleships, destroyers, and submarines.
Which led to the famous, slightly exaggerated headline that Pepsi was a naval superpower.
It's an incredible anecdote, but for a deep dive, the structural reality check is mandatory. The sources clarify the logistical constraint. The fleet consisted of decommissioned vessels, often in various states of disrepair, and certainly not combat ready.
Pepsi obviously had no intention or capacity to operate a military fleet.
Of course not. The ships were quickly transferred to a salvage company and sold for scrap metal.
So the ultimate takeaway here isn't the humor of the situation. It's the severe structural conclusion. This complex, bizarre transaction was not a corporate whim. It was a transaction of profound necessity.
It was dictated entirely by the twin constraints of a non-convertible currency system and punishing international sanctions. Geopolitical and financial realities forced Pepsi to accept scrap metal in the form of warships just to keep its supply chain and market presence operating.
It illustrates perfectly how far a company must bend its entire financial model to maintain market entry once it has been achieved in a highly constrained environment.
And that willingness to bend boundaries and test limits brings us naturally to Part 4, where we look at the mechanisms that govern mass-scale marketing when enthusiasm collides with cold, hard contract law.
The legendary Harrier jet case.
This takes us to 1996 and the height of the Cola Wars. Pepsi was struggling to attract a younger audience away from Coca-Cola and launched the Pepsi Stuff loyalty program.
Customers earned Pepsi points redeemable for branded merchandise.
And the structural loophole, which proved crucial to the later court case, was the ability for customers to purchase points for 10 cents each, provided they redeemed at least 15 points acquired from actually drinking the product.
To advertise this promotion, Pepsi ran a television commercial that showed various items customers could obtain: t-shirts, sunglasses, jackets.
Culminating in a highly exaggerated, computer-generated visual of an AV-8B Harrier II jump jet landing outside a suburban high school. The jet was labeled as costing 7 million Pepsi points.
Here's where the analysis becomes real. Enter John Leonard, a 21-year-old business student from Seattle. He recognized the financial arbitrage opportunity.
Leonard did the math. If he could buy 7 million points at 10 cents each, the jet would cost roughly $700,000 plus a nominal fee.
For a military aircraft that, according to defense sources at the time, was valued somewhere between $23 and $37 million.
Leonard secured investment from 4 friends and submitted his official order form. He included 15 Pepsi points, the item description, 1 Harrier jet, and a cashier's check for over $700,000.
And Pepsi's response was, well, predictable. They rejected the submission, explaining that the inclusion of the jet in the ad was purely fanciful and intended to be a piece of zany humor.
They pointed out that the official promotional catalog, which defined the specific terms of the contest, did not list the jet.
Leonard, however, refused to back down. He pursued the legal route, claiming a breach of contract based on the advertisement being a clear, legally binding offer.
The core of the case, Leonard v. PepsiCo, Inc., became a landmark decision on the boundaries of advertising puffery.
The legal dispute hinged entirely on objective contractual intent. The court, presided over by Judge Kimball Wood, ultimately sided with PepsiCo.
And the court's reasoning is essential here, as it established a clear precedent for how far advertisers can push humor without creating liability. There were 3 main prongs to the reasoning.
What were they?
First, the court examined the legal requirement for an advertisement to be a binding offer. It must be clear, definite, and explicit, and leaves nothing open for negotiation.
And the court found that commercial failed this test.
It did, because it explicitly referred viewers to the physical catalog for necessary details, and the catalog was the legally binding document, which did not include the jet. So the commercial was only an invitation to negotiate.
Right, not a concrete offer.
Precisely. The second, and more widely cited point, addressed the standard of the objective person. The court stated emphatically that no objective, reasonable person could possibly conclude that a soft drink company was seriously offering a $23 million highly restricted military asset for $700,000.
It was classified as textbook puffery.
Exactly. Exaggerated claims not meant to be taken literally, and Judge Wood highlighted several elements that made the offer nonsensical.
The highly improbable scenario of the teenage protagonist being a qualified pilot.
The extreme danger of landing a sophisticated attack jet in a residential area next to a school bicycle rack.
And the fact that the Harrier's primary mission is to attack and destroy surface targets.
Using it for school transportation was deemed fundamentally absurd. The court even used the math to reinforce the absurdity, connecting back to the scale of consumption required.
I remember this part.
The court noted that to acquire 7 million points solely through consumption, a person would have to drink 190 Pepsis per day for 100 years.
That logistical absurdity reinforced the judicial finding that the offer was clearly made in jest.
And while the court clearly protected PepsiCo, the lawsuit itself forced them to be more cautious. The immediate aftermath is telling. Pepsi won the case, but they immediately updated the commercial.
They raised the price for the Harrier jet to an impossible 700 million Pepsi points and added a very clear text-based, just kidding disclaimer.
This case perfectly illustrates how the necessary aggressiveness of a challenger brand's marketing strategy, pushing the limits to generate buzz risks, collapsing into unwanted, expensive legal transactions, forcing the court to step in and define the boundary between sales enthusiasm and legally binding commitment.
Now let's pivot from testing legal limits to testing cultural limits in Part V, the high cost of cultural relevance, exemplified by the 2017 Kendall Jenner advertisement.
This is where Pepsi's historical Pepsi generation identity that need to be the hip, fashion-forward, culturally aware, live-for-the-moment alternative created maximum risk.
Because being timely demands perfect cultural calibration. And in 2017, Pepsi's calibration failed spectacularly.
They attempted to capitalize on this cultural currency with the Live for Now Moments anthem commercial. The stated goal was to project a global message of unity, peace, and understanding, specifically targeting politically aware millennials.
The ad's plot was what sparked the immediate backlash. It opens with Kendall Jenner modeling at a photo shoot. She then dramatically removes her wig and dark lipstick to join this youthful, very vague street protest.
The crowd is clean-cut, carrying signs that read generic messages like peace and join the conversation.
And the climax is the moment that sealed the ad's fate. Jenner walks to a line of solemn police officers and she hands one of them a can of Pepsi.
This act is immediately followed by cheering, high fives from the crowd, and the implied dissolution of all the tension.
The backlash was instantaneous and widespread. The ad was overwhelmingly criticized for trivializing Black Lives Matter and police brutality by aesthetically co-opting the visuals of serious, often painful social justice movements to market a sugary beverage.
The sources identified the failure through two powerful rhetorical concepts. Let's look first at failed kairos.
Kairos, the Greek concept of knowing the appropriate time and context.
Exactly. The ad aired during a period of high tension and prominence for the Black Lives Matter movement, where news of tragic, violent interactions with police remained raw and immediate.
Critics argued Pepsi failed to understand that the timing was inappropriate, suggesting that the resolution to deep-seated systemic conflict was as cheap as a can of soda.
It presented a clean, smiling, easily resolved protest, which was a stark contrast to the often confrontational and serious real-world images people were seeing in the news.
Then there is the issue of weak ethos.
Or lack of credibility. PepsiCo is a snack and beverage company driven by profit, and critics felt it inherently lacked the credibility to address such complex political matters.
And furthermore, Kendall Jenner herself, a wealthy, white, uninvolved celebrity, was seen as having weak ethos to portray an activist leader in a scene mimicking a Black Lives Matter protest.
Critics argued she represented the exact opposite of the movement's needs. Her privilege allowed her to casually stroll up to armed officers without fear, an option unavailable to many people involved in real protests.
The rhetorical failure was comprehensive. PepsiCo initially tried to justify the ad as being about living life unbounded, but that only inflamed the situation.
The consequences were swift. PepsiCo pulled the ad within a day and issued two separate apologies, acknowledging publicly that they had missed the mark.
The measurable impact on public perception was significant. Net positive sentiment on Twitter dropped by a substantial 14 percentage points in the immediate aftermath.
But the lasting impact is the structural learning that came out of this. Other brands watched Pepsi's failure and adjusted their strategies. The industry learned that mere aesthetic performance is no longer enough.
The phrase all performance and no action became a warning.
Exactly. Subsequent brand activism, particularly after 2020, often included tangible actions, specific financial donations, internal policy changes, to avoid the perception of purely cashing in on social ills. The core motivation of profit remained, but the packaging of that activism changed dramatically, directly in response to the Pepsi fiasco.
It's the ultimate paradox of the challenger brand. The necessary strategy of being timely and of the moment carries the maximum risk of immediate, massive cultural failure.
And that high volatility forced PepsiCo to seek stability elsewhere, leading us to Part 6, where the company attempts to mitigate the inherent volatility of the soda and pop culture market through wholesale diversification.
The first and most critical step toward building that stability occurred long ago in 1965.
The creation of PepsiCo Inc. resulted from the merger of Pepsi-Cola and Frito-Lay Inc.
Why was synthesizing a soft drink and a snack food company considered a marriage made in heaven?
It was a structural masterpiece based on logistical synergy. Coca-Cola and Pepsi both relied on a warehouse distribution model. Frito-Lay, however, used a highly effective independent store-door distribution network.
Where salespeople delivered directly to individual retail outlets.
Right. By merging, PepsiCo gained instant access to Frito-Lay's highly efficient granular distribution system, optimizing logistics and market reach for both product types simultaneously.
And then there's the obvious product synergy. Salty snacks drive beverage consumption.
The merger immediately created a powerful single company offering both. By 2019, PepsiCo boasted 22 distinct billion-dollar brands, operating in over 200 countries.
Encompassing Frito-Lay, Quaker Oats, Tropicana, and Gatorade, alongside the founding Pepsi-Cola brand.
And this diversification proved absolutely essential, especially as the company navigated complex, protectionist regulatory environments globally. A perfect example is the immense political and logistical struggle Pepsi faced entering the Indian market in the late 1980s.
The entry was intensely controversial. Pepsi struggled for 5 years just to gain approval, facing 20 separate debates in the Indian parliament.
They finally gained entry in 1989, but only after agreeing to severe foreign direct investment policies designed to protect the domestic economy and agriculture.
These entry conditions forced Pepsi to become a developmental partner, not just a seller of soda.
They had to agree to a 74% export focus initially and mandatory commitments to agricultural development and employment in India. This meant establishing large-scale fruit and vegetable processing plants and engaging in contract farming for crops like tomatoes and potatoes in Punjab.
So to sell soda and chips, they had to become agricultural development experts and exporters.
Exactly. Once India liberalized its economy in the 1990s, Pepsi leveraged these foundational investments. Their beverage production grew by 420% in just 5 years.
And the sources attribute their sustained success in India heavily to aggressive localization and superior distribution efficiency. The data on localization is particularly striking.
We see analysis showing a high localization index for their snack products, like potato chips, reaching 8.9 out of 10. This resulted in a dominant 67% market share.
An analysis showed that products with a higher localization index grew 3.2 times faster in the Indian market.
But the overarching trend today is the most recent structural imperative: the need to move away from the product that founded the company. Since 2012, the global soft drink industry has suffered slow growth due to consumer preferences rapidly shifting toward healthier options.
So diversification, which started as a synergistic growth strategy in 1965, has now become an essential necessity for maintaining profit stability.
Exactly. PepsiCo has made diversification its absolute priority, moving aggressively into adjacent healthy categories. Ready-to-drink teas, coffees, bottled, and sparkling water.
This includes the massive $3.2 billion purchase of SodaStream in 2018.
Right, reflecting a commitment to the in-home sparkling water segment. However, the shift isn't easy because the consumer landscape presents a complex obstacle, what we can call the health paradox.
And what's it?
The data reveals a frustrating reality for PepsiCo. On one hand, the need to shift is confirmed. 61% of urban youth are actively reducing their carbonated soft drink consumption, and 78% of consumers still associate the traditional Pepsi brand with high sugar.
So the demographic shift is real, but the paradox is the financial resistance.
Right. While a strong 82% of consumers say they want healthier beverage options, only 38% are actually willing to pay a financial premium for them.
So that structural reality, the consumer demanding health benefits, but resisting the associated cost forces PepsiCo to maintain a careful balancing act.
Ultimately, the diversification into Frito-Lay, Quaker Oats, and bottled water is now the foundational stability of PepsiCo, moving the company far beyond its original identity as merely a challenger cola company.
This has been a true deep dive into the constraints and choices that define PepsiCo. Let's quickly summarize the key structural mechanisms we've uncovered.
Pepsi's entire history is defined by how structural necessity forced immediate, disruptive innovation. Early financial instability, caused by sugar speculation, compelled the company to adopt the volume for price innovation during the Depression.
Global logistics and the hard constraints of the Cold War economy forced the company to become a complex international trading house, culminating in that ingenious, albeit bizarre, barter deal involving Russian vodka and ultimately decommissioned naval vessels as collateral.
And its fierce rivalry with Coca-Cola necessitated the aggressive, youth-oriented branding, the Pepsi generation, which became the engine of its success but also the source of its greatest public relations and legal risks.
We saw that vividly in the Harrier Jet court case over advertising puffery and the catastrophic cultural misstep of the Kendall Jenner ad.
Today, rapidly changing consumer health perceptions have forced PepsiCo to abandon its dependence on soda, making strategic diversification into complex, localized food markets an absolute mandate for sustained survival and growth.
We see a company whose survival depended on constantly changing its identity and its operational structure just to survive the next chapter.
Which leaves us with a provocative final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. The entire history of the Cola Wars defined Pepsi as the dynamic, timely challenger, the brand built on being of the moment and constantly adapting.
But what are the long-term structural implications when a brand built on change must eventually find a stable, diversified identity in salty snacks, water, and oats just to guarantee its survival?
Does the necessity of structural stability eventually erode the very identity built on constant movement and timely relevance?
That is a question that requires continuous critical exploration. We know that you, the listener, may arrive here with different levels of familiarity with business history, contract law, or geopolitical trade.
Our goal remains the same: to reinforce that true understanding develops over time across multiple topics and episodes. This deep dive is part of an ongoing WhyItTV series examining influential ideas, brands, and systems, and we invite you to continue this exploration with us.